All right. Hello and welcome to A to Gen Z. This is our 3-part webinar series talking all about Gen Z. So that's our youngest demographic, so ages 10 to about 25. This is a 3-part series that we have been doing. And if you missed last week, we had a fantastic panel of 6 young people talking all about their generation, their faith lives. And today we are going to tackle a subject that really everybody I have talked to in the last year and a half has just been dying to know. So in particular, when we look at Gen Z, what is it about this pandemic that has shaped them? What has turned them into maybe some different habits and some different lifestyles? So we have an expert panel here today to talk about that. And I'm so excited to introduce them in a moment. But if you are following along, feel free to check out cph.org/Gen Z. And that will give you a great study guide. It'll give you access to last week's panel talking all about Gen Z from their own mouths. But we're going to talk all about pandemic and Gen Z today. So I am your host, Cassie Moore. I'm an author and director of Next Generation Ministries in Houston, Texas at St. Mark Lutheran Church and School. And I am privileged to have wonderful people with me today. So we will just dive in. Who wants to be the brave soul to introduce themselves first here?
I will go ahead.
All right.
I'm AJ Vega. I serve at Acts Church Lander as the Director of Discipleship and Family Life. Been here for the past year and a half. We moved a month before COVID hit. So yeah, everything has pretty much changed. And I don't even know if I'm doing what my job description tells me. So
Awesome.
I'm Julianna Schultz. I'm a DCE who serves as a program manager here at LCMS Youth Ministry here in St. Louis, and co-author of Relationships Count in that research project. So excited to be here with you guys.
My name is Jeremy Becker. I'm a DCE and I serve as a Director of Youth and Family Ministry at St. Paul Lutheran Church in Weston, Florida. Been serving here since 2012. So thankfully, a few more years before COVID hit, unlike AJ. And I work primarily with youth and families here at St. Paul, and but you get a little bit of everything, so it's a lot of fun.
I'm Mark Kiessling. I work with Julianna and LCMS Youth Ministry in St. Louis, Missouri. So worked on a number of research pieces as well as some of the programmatic things that we do out of for the Synod, out of LCMS Youth Ministry and the Office of National Mission.
Great. Well, thank you guys all for being here today. We are going to dive into some questions. So from your perspective, you all work with young people in some capacity. How would you describe Gen Z? What would you say makes them different from previous generations, especially when you consider that you are working with them, you are investing in their lives, you're working with leaders who work with them. So what, in your opinion, makes them different from other generations?
I'll jump in. As I see Gen Z, they have had access to everything at their fingertips from the time that they can remember. So unlike my generation, which joined Facebook in their 30s and social media in their 30s, they were part of social media and experiencing the world at their fingertips before they were supposed to. What was even allowed, right? And so this generation has access to everything, and there's positives and negatives to that. And I think as we look at what they're able to do and how they're able to communicate, it's something that we have to be aware of because we didn't experience growing up with that. We've experienced it as adults, and so it didn't form and shape us like it's shaping this generation.
Cassie, I really resonated with one of your guests from last week said was a word that I would have said when you first asked that was aware. And I think it connects to with what Jeremy said is because of social media and media in general. I'm amazed at the conversations I can have with a Gen Zer at such a young age. And sometimes, again, I think there's pros and cons we can probably talk about the fact that they're having those conversations. Things that I was not worried about until I was 20, 30, and they're talking about them at 12 and 13. And so how does that play into understanding of that worldview, that type of thing is pretty amazing to me. And I think it's accelerated over the last couple of generations.
Yeah, that's a hard place to be as an adult, because you sometimes forget I'm still dealing with kids sometimes. And this may be a really mature topic and a mature conversation, but I have to balance that adult response of giving them enough information, but not too much information. And sometimes knowing they may know more than me about this subject, which is humbling, right? So yeah, that's a great point.
I would also add to that they're an action-oriented generation, right? Both that they're forming their identity around the things that they do a lot more than maybe previous generations did, and an expectation that other people and themselves can and should be acting and doing and moving forward. They're incredibly passionate, they're entrepreneurial, but they are also very much about I believe I can do something. I think, and that's different than maybe a generation before, where like I grew up being told like you can do anything, and that's maybe not true. Like I can't there are lots of things I can't do, but Gen Z's kind of got a little bit more pragmatic about it, in that like they're not believing they can do anything, but they do firmly believe that they can have an impact, that they can have purpose, that they're passionate about seeing achievement and drive towards the things that they feel really passionate about. And that can be really great, and that can also have some really difficult implications for them as well.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point for us to understand. They're action oriented, but the downside of that is they are impatient. I've described them before as anxious and eager at the same time, and that is part of our role as adults, I think, to help navigate them through that, because we know things take time, and it takes time. Growth especially takes time, and maturity is a long process. But that's something, when you've been raised with technology that's constantly hitting you, ding, ding, ding all the time, it has fostered a generation that just expects instant results. That is not life, right?
Yeah, and I think to go off of that too, and some of the pieces that you were talking about, Mark, as far as the awareness piece, I think like with the entrepreneurial spirit that they have, they've become content creators way far in advance than I could even imagine. And it's just amazing to see all these different trends, all these different movements that have been happening, because they've been able to take up the mantle and being able to lead in their own way, because of so many accessibilities to technology, connections with other people, and all that. So.
Yeah, and I think that that leads us into another good question. What are the weaknesses and the strengths that you see in this generation? Because we have the ability to step back a little bit, and being a little bit older than them, to say, these are things we really love about you, but here are some areas that you are weak. And as the adults who care about you and love you, here are the ways that we want to step in and see the truth and be able to navigate with you through this. So what would you guys say strengths and weaknesses of this generation?
Hey, maybe to tie into it, something you said a little earlier, Cassie, about they're impatient. I think with access to as much information as they have, often I think they underestimate the importance of experience, and the value that comes with having tried some things and failed at some things, so I think they're, in some ways, they're very willing to learn from mentors. We heard that last week. They're willing to learn, but they maybe struggle a little bit with getting out there and trying and failing, especially because they tie so much of who they are around what they do and the success in those things. And so often when we tie ourselves to, I'm an A+ student, or I'm the best soccer player, or whatever, when those things stop being true, even if it's a small failure, that's not just like I got to C on a test. It's a who am I kind of question. If I'm not this, then what does that say about me? And so I think there's some pieces in their action orientatedness that can be really big pitfalls for them as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things with Gen Z, and I'm I'm not that far off. I was born in '93, so I'm like a zillennial, I guess is how you would coin me, I guess. But I would say they're resilient, and I think resilience has strengths and weaknesses. Resilience in the fact that they were born in the midst of all these tragedies that have happened over these past 10 plus years, and so they've been able to be aware of some of those things that have happened and being able to bounce back from those, but also at the same time resilience in the sense of I think it's sometimes hard for Gen Z to like accept certain criticisms, and I think they only receive it in the environment of a safe relationship, and that takes a lot of trust and a lot of time to be able to build off of that in order to kind of grow that way.
Yeah, that is something we heard a lot last week from that generation, was the importance of relationships and a mentoring relationship, and how it's something that universally across that panel, at least, that they all desire, they all look for, they all want that in their lives. So I think that's a great opportunity, like you both said, just to speak into that sense of identity that they're searching for, and to remind them, you're a child of God, you're a redeemed, forgiven child of the King. So that's where we start. That's our base.
It's interesting, AJ, ironic maybe, their openness to criticism isn't that great, but their openness to just about everything else is huge, right? And an acceptance of what's out there and of people who are different. And they, this generation probably celebrates diversity better than any generation we've experienced. It is more diverse than any generation we've had in this country, right? So that's part of it. But and so there's some positives that are around that big time, but there's also some negatives, especially when you start talking ministry and what is truth and what we believe and how that plays in, because who am I to tell them what is right and what's wrong? And those kinds of things can become difficult if we're not having a great communication and an open relationship.
This goes along a lot of the stuff that's been said. I think probably each older generation says this about the younger generation, maybe, but I think we would say they're overcommitted or highly committed to a lot of different things, so maybe easily distractible. And so I think especially maybe when we're the older generation that wants things to look like it did for us, and why aren't they coming, maybe speaking of youth ministry terms, why aren't they coming to our youth ministry events? Why, they got so much stuff going on. I think that can kind of play into it might be a transition for us, but be able to listen well. And to see, actually, you really do have committed young people. It's just going to maybe look different. And you're going to see that commitment in different ways. And so how do we listen well to get that connection? So that can both be trying to, come together as a church and find that unity. But then at the same time, too, the strength is to say that they really are committed. I mean, it's so exciting to work with young students and see their love for Jesus and the desire that they want to impact our world. And so how do we walk alongside them in those times, even though it's highly distractible, all the options they have to be doing stuff and to be committed to different stuff.
Yeah, and that leads me to really the next big question that we are grappling with here. How have you guys seen the culture of young people change in the course of your careers? Because I know I've been out for 13 years now. It is a totally different ball game. I'm doing youth ministry completely differently than I did even 5 years ago. Things have changed that rapidly. And I know for me, for instance, like so much of my job it's on my phone. I am texting kids. There are students that I have not seen in 7 or 8 or 9 years who every week they are texting me. They are coming to me with their problems. They are coming to me with their celebrations, and that's an ongoing discipling relationship, though I have not seen them in person in that long. So what would you guys say? What stands out to you as how ministry has changed in the last handful of years in your career?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Cassie. When I started, there were very few people that had cell phones. And so they've become smart in the process, phones or people, I'm not sure which. And at such a young age. So when we started using phones to communicate and gathering that information, I remember having to ask the question, am I allowed to text you? Can you receive text messages on your phone? And now it's like, I'd rather you text me than call me. And so those things have changed. Technology's changed. We've worked with it. A similarity, though, which is really kind of cool, and you alluded to it right there, is that whether they're coming to an event or activity, they crave that connection with people, the community, the communication. That the need for that hasn't changed. How we do it has, but that is still a huge important thing from 20 plus years ago, connecting one-on-one or connecting in small groups to connecting today. We do it differently, but it's still a huge need and wanted by this generation as much as when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
I think to maybe tie into that a little bit is, I think when I started doing youth ministry, there was, at least to some degree, an assumption of like, I'm an expert, right? And there's sort of an automatic trust that you had for the adults that you had in your youth group, who were leading, and sort of looking to them automatically as people who could be trusted to talk to you and to navigate through that. And I think you heard a lot of that last week, and I think it's really true. This generation is not just going to automatically trust anybody. And that sometimes that even goes as far as including the people in their own family, right? Like, you have to earn that. You have to earn that respect. You have to earn that trust. You have to earn the right to be heard. They have a lot of voices in their lives. They're saying a lot of different things, and you don't, and the church doesn't get any benefits from just being the church. In fact, in some ways, it's harder for Gen Z to trust the church, because they tie it to all sorts of other institutional things and problems they see. So it's, I think, a point that's really, Cassie, you're even talking about people texting you. It really has become about, okay, I need to make sure that I have adults around every young person who are Jesus-centered, who are Christ-focused, but who are earning that trust every day in conversations and in the way that we talk and in how we handle conflict, that show young people and show up for young people in a way that makes us a voice that they want to listen to and trust when they come to issues and struggles.
Yeah, I think our faithful example is huge to this younger generation. And I think too, you bring up a good point. This is a major source of conflict between Gen Z and other generations, because it is humbling. And I have been in this position several times where a student has just in the middle of class or in the middle of youth group has basically sassed back to me and put, tried to put me in my place. And I think that is something we are seeing more and more, because they just are exposed to more. They think they have a lot of knowledge. They have access to a lot of information. And, if you have 20,000 followers on your social media accounts when you're 13 years old, that's quite an ego boost, right? So we are seeing this conflict in our younger generation with our older generation. And I think that's a good takeaway for us as adults who care about them, to say, it's okay. They're going to push against us. They're going to test us. We're going to have to earn this, but that's okay. I am old enough and wise enough to be fine. My identity is not wrapped up in this either, right? Like, I am solid. So we just withstand them pushing against us. So excellent point. Any other thoughts? Have you seen the culture of young people change throughout your own career?
I think from a youth ministry standpoint, it's gone from, we've looked at youth ministry from churches from a communal standpoint to now more of an individualistic standpoint. And just like you were saying, Cassie, like as far as texting students individually, I think it also includes just the act of listening and authentic relationships, because that's something that they crave. And so I was just talking with a buddy of mine who's DCE, and I feel like students now are so resilient to the like token listening, where you're just there and you're just going through the motions. That was his term, not mine. And just being able to actually be present with them or show up to the things that they're doing, to be able to engage with them. I think that's something that has really changed from this communal aspect, where it's come and see, where it's instead we're going to you and being able to experience doing life with you together.
I would echo everything that was said here. Some of those things that I would certainly look through, going from, I think, postmodern to post-truth in just a short amount of time, and using that language and what that means. And that's not Gen Z's fault. That's the culture around them. And then how it gets put into them through social media and other things. We all know, going through the pandemic, what that's looked like, of trying to find reliable sources. I think one thing I'll say, just to go another turn, is that I think we've seen in some of our leadership development pieces and things, is that you really do then have this core group of young people who are attached for a reason. Like there's a reason why they're there. And they are highly focused because I think Julianna and others said, maybe the institution of church is not seen as the safe place in your general community anymore, where that would have been the place where we could have kids go and have a community. That maybe isn't the case. And so when young people are at church, they're there for a reason. Either family has them there, they want to be there, they're engaging. And so, man, the depth of the conversation, the opportunities you have to engage them in service is really a beautiful thing that we see in terms of they love Jesus, they love their churches, they love the body of Christ around them. And it's really added to some deep levels of service and conversation.
Yeah, and I think too, we sort of allude to this, but AJ, especially what you were saying, the individual connection that we have right now, I'll be honest, we are not seeing that across the board, with groups coming back, especially post-pandemic. And I use the term post-pandemic lightly because we are still very much in the middle of things right now. But for me and for the people that I talk to all across the country, there has been a huge hit in terms of kids wanting to come back. And I would say especially our high schoolers and our college-aged young adults, they have been hit hard, and I think they are having a hard time wanting to come back to anything in person. I know earlier this year, we had a lot of DCEs nationally doing a discussion on disengagement, just saying that is an epidemic we are seeing right now in our churches all over the place, just complete disengagement. So I know that's something we're going to hit on a little bit later in our questions, but if you are watching this feeling like, man, maybe I'm the only one that has no kids showing up to youth group, or 2 kids showing up when I used to have 20, that is very normal right now. And it's something to just let yourself off the hook for that, because your relationships are seen in different ways. They're experienced in different ways in students' lives too.
I do think it's one of those things that we look at this generation and we can kind of see that they struggle to find safety, right? Safety's always been an issue for them. I mean, they're a generation that's known a lot of war and conflicts and issues with violence and with a lack of necessarily trusted institutions and pandemics. And I think there is a need for us to be incredibly empathetic to a generation that has very little space where they feel safe. And that includes is not always safe to be online. And that's with them 24/7. And so making sure that the church is a place, and I'm not saying we don't need to challenge them with law or anything like that, but a place where they know they are protected and cared for and warm, that they can land in and feel safe. It's hard, and it's going to be a hard road to get them back on this, in part because they're very concerned about that in their lives.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know with my youth leadership team, I've got an excellent group of people that just serve faithfully and love the kids at our church. But we have had that conversation many times in the last couple of months that we have to go after every single student individually. And it is a lot of work. But every single event we have, we are dividing out the names of the teens that we want to be there. And we are going after these teens individually. And I think that that's going to be something we see more of. We see the need to do that more, to have those personal connections. And that's a lot of work, but it's an opportunity for us to speak some truth and to be present in students' lives. So let me ask this. This is really the big question everybody is talking about. How have you seen this generation impacted by the pandemic? From where you sit, and you guys have some various roles, how have you seen change? Where have you seen people be impacted? Knowing all we know about Gen Z, but what have you seen the pandemic do to Gen Z?
I've seen a lot of different. It's not a one size fits all problem. There are some that have reacted to this and thrived in the midst of this because the online connections and the self-guided learning process in quarantine fit who they were and their gifts, and they actually did better in those situations. And so that's an interesting concept to look at. And then there's others who are quite the opposite, could not wait to be back in person, waiting for their schools to open, parents waiting for their schools to open because they're the ones who are admittedly noticing that their grades were taking a big hit. And so from an academic standpoint, you have obviously a few different sides of the perspective there. But then emotionally too, I think that one is probably more negative than not, just because the isolation that occurred and trying to connect and how does that play out? And so, talking with parents and talking with the, Gen Zers themselves, if you can get a great, open, honest conversation about what is it like going through this? Some have thrown their hands up and said, I'm fine like this, and I'm going to just connect online, and they're just stuck in their rooms, and that's what they're doing. And then it's a point of how do we get them reconnected into what's going on outside of whatever they're looking at on their screens. And so there's definitely a struggle that I've seen in terms of created raised anxiety levels because of that. When they're in social situations that they haven't been in, learning about how to navigate those, how do we actually communicate face to face, what is appropriate and what isn't, and how do we do that? So it's interesting. I've seen both sides of this, play out, but I think definitely, a generation that was already connected, in virtual spaces before this had to live in those virtual spaces. And one of the biggest things that I've seen just in a few recent conversations in the last couple of weeks with parents is that there was very little help in how to navigate that. I grew up with my parents helping me understand how to communicate with people. You shake a person's hand, you address them this way, you talk this way, you watch me as I interact with my peers, and now you're going to interact with, and parents haven't done that, or nobody's done that. We've just said, here's a device, you're connected to everything, good luck. It's not how do we communicate, how do we do this, what's an appropriate way of doing this, and we haven't walked with people through that, and even the pandemic just raised that the problems in the lack of being able to communicate appropriately to higher levels.
I think to your point, Jeremy, too, I think this pandemic has really solidified safe spaces specifically, where, I've seen students that, in processing with them doing online schooling, they're like, yeah, I get together with, 2 or 3 people and, we do homework together. And so it's like this collaborative thing that they're doing, and they're finding some different spaces, but they've really had the opportunity to reprioritize what's actually important to them. And I think because of that, it's become a lot harder for institutions like the church to be able to say, hey, we love for you to come back or to be a part of our youth ministry, because they already have their own safe spaces. They're like, why would I go anywhere else? And being able to allow themselves to kind of isolate or socially distance from other communities, I think has been a big thing that we've seen with this pandemic.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I had not considered. They already created a safe bubble for themselves, and I think that's a generational trend too, right? They already gravitated towards smaller friendship groups than previous generations. So they are that much more entrenched. And we also know that the pandemic has changed a lot of friendships. Especially I think in our middle schoolers, the kids that I interact with, their friendships have they upended, not being able to see the same kids in class for so long and going back and establishing different routines. That has really changed a lot. And I think there's a lot of relational trauma that is still very actively a part of our students' lives that we have to consider that. So how else have you seen the pandemic shape Gen Z? What are you guys seeing? What do you notice?
On one positive side, Jeremy kind of touched on it about the technology side. We did love to see for a while, this was maybe early in the pandemic, how many young people got put into places of leadership because they could get their church online. So all of a sudden it was, we need to do our services online. Let's call Gen Z in to make that happen. They're used to that, it's their world. And how many were asked to step into leadership and make that happen was really exciting to see. And to really lead the older generation. And I think it gave us an insight to, well, maybe what does the church need to be doing more of to reach that generation and future generations. and to help us take that step that was sometimes difficult, no doubt, and bumpy along the way, and still learning along the way.
I was a little nervous as we went into pandemic with a generation that was so about achievement orientated, that when things weren't going to happen, how that was going to impact them. And honestly, like, they have been super resilient in many ways, and like navigated through that. And I have seen more young people figure out how to start their own business, or like, we're going to figure out the way to see my friends. They're going to be inventive, and they're going to be creative in how they got to where they go, which is incredible to see. I think the flip side to that is they are still young. And I think there are lots of parents and adults around them who are stressed and tired and traumatized and hurting, and those adults have less capacity to care for teenagers who look on the surface like they're okay. And I think we have a huge amount of concern about Gen Z and their mental health, but that's not just Gen Z. I mean, that's everybody's struggling right now, even adults who are very mature and capable are struggling right now. And I think that is going to have some long-term effects for Gen Z when they don't have the adults around them to help them walk through this in a healthy way, when they suddenly have to really mourn the loss of 2 years of school and school events and sports seasons and life experience and things that they were looking forward to that were very different than what they expected. I think they're going to put on a brave face and they're going to be creative, but I think the adults around them also need to be very conscientious that we have to be paying very close attention to their mental health at this point, because they're hurting and they don't have as many coping skills as we do. And we are all familiar with how little our coping skills are working at this point for many of us.
That's very true. And it echoes something I remember reading a while ago, was how many kids are hiding their stress over COVID and over what they're facing. And I remember reading, like, teenage girls are the most likely to hide all of their COVID stress, but the number of people that think this is going to have lifelong impact on me, it's very, very high. So most of our young people are saying, we know this is going to be a pivotal experience in our life that will change us forever, but we don't want to share that stress with anybody because we don't want to worry anybody around us. So I think you're right. We have to pay really close attention to them, and we have to be aware that they need some help coping, and they may not know how to reach out to us. They may not know how to put it into words because they don't have the same life experience as some of us, right? But they need that hope and they need that relationship just as much as anybody. So that's a great point. I will bring up, I have noticed, just in terms of changes, this generation is trending towards touchless. They don't, they're much more cautious about what they're touching. And I know that's a comment I've heard from youth leaders across the country. Like, I have had to rethink every game that I do with students because they don't want to touch each other. So have you guys seen that as well? There's a trend towards not wanting to be as close.
I haven't seen that too much with the youth. Their parents, however, are definitely concerned about that. And it's less so, I think, than when it first started, because it's been determined that it's more in the air and particles than it is touching. But that was definitely, every game that we were going to say we were going to do, we had to come up with some alternative. Pool noodles was the way we touched other things and other people for a while in games, and that became actually more dangerous, I think. But I found that their parents actually were more concerned about that than they have been.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and I think it's. Oh, go ahead, AJ.
Well, I was just gonna say, I still don't know what to do when I interact with people. Like, I don't know. Like, I always do this like weird dance that I'm moving around. And we have like hand sanitizer at every table that we do whenever we do different activities. But I think part of the issue as far as spacing goes, when I was doing a confirmation class with our students, and we all spaced at individual tables, and it took away from the intimacy of having real conversation in that sense. And so I think spacing was definitely more of an issue rather than the kind of touchless kind of, So
Yeah, and AJ, I was gonna say, I think social awkwardness it's been a huge thing that we have to accept that this generation is gonna need some guidance through it. There is that weird, I was just at a wedding last weekend. Like, do I hug people? Do I shake hands? Is it person to person? It's different, and it feels awkward for me. And I'm a pretty outgoing person. So you add in a teenager or a young person who's just entering the workforce, who's trying to navigate something that's totally new anyway. That is some area where they need a little bit of guidance. And I think we have to recognize across the board, it's just still weird for all of us. But I think we're going to continue to see that, as we look at future generations coming in, we're going to have to be intentional about where do we place them? How do we arrange their seating arrangement? What kind of discussion questions can we give them? Because they have to make a farther jump than other generations maybe have done. So, all right, we have some space for some questions coming in too. So anything else we want to throw in about how we're seeing Gen Z impacted by the pandemic? And then we will get to a few of these questions we've got.
Yeah, there were two other thoughts that I had. One is the fact that while they're impacted by the pandemic from socially distanced aspect, being online, all that, many of them have been impacted because their family members have lost jobs or lost their life, or have gone through some health crises in the midst of this. And so it's not just a matter of being isolated from other people or having to quarantine. It's a matter of actually dealing with some of the loss that has occurred, and how to go about sharing that, living that, and getting support and help with that. I see them more open to those conversations about mental health than our generation ever was, and dealing with those kind of stressors. So I think that's a good thing. The fact they have to do that at such a young age really stinks. The other big byproduct is the fact that without going political, it went so political, and so these young people, the Gen Zers, are watching these groups of people fight about something that, as you fear to talk with them, it was like, that's shouldn't be an issue. Why are we fighting about this? And so not necessarily great role models being played out in their older generation counterparts and dealing with this and how it's been dealt with, and even how the church is fought in the midst of all this too. They see that, and their authenticity radars of who we are as Christians have like blaring, is this what's going on? This isn't right. And so there's some of that conversation that I see them having, that, stuff we've got to work through.
I think one of the things that'll be interesting too is that every young person is going to have a pandemic story. I think there's some national tragedies that have happened in our country that, depending on how much you paid attention to the news, or maybe what the profession your parents were in, maybe it didn't affect you as much. There's not going to be a young person who's not going to be able to say, I lost 2 weeks of school, 2 months of school, year of school, because of the way it affected our country, and not really having a collective experience like that in our society for quite some time now. It'll be something interesting. Again, I think through this generation, we're going to have trusting adults who will be able to walk them through it, but then also how they lead through that, because it's going to be something that all of them are going to have known.
And we meet them, right, with non-judgment at first. We have to, that's something we heard over and over again last week was, these relationships that you want to have with us, we need you to not judge what we're telling you. We need to be open and to trust you. And that is, as we've mentioned, there's some resentment towards adults, towards older generations, that we are just going to have to swallow our pride maybe for a while and say, okay, I'm here. Feel free to bring it to me. So that'll be an interesting thing, I think, to watch over the next coming generations, how that is handled. We have a few questions here from some of our online viewers. And if you do have a question, feel free to drop it in the comments. We are looking at these live. So we have one question from Mary here. So she says she's a grandma. She's concerned about the younger generations. Where she is in Colorado, she said, should they be allowed to meet outdoors and not in the traditional ways of worship? Anybody have thoughts on that? Meeting in creative spaces where you're able to praise God, maybe out in nature?
We've been doing some events outside, and right after quarantine, especially when we were kind of navigating back to in-person events, tried to hold a lot of things outside. And so what we did seemed to work all right. And youth, parents, families, whatever the event was, got some pretty good response. Some things actually, because there was nothing else going on, got a bigger response than we had done it pre-pandemic. So that was kind of cool. We have in Florida moved to a lot of back to indoor spaces again. We try to stay distance when we can, masks depending on the situation or scenario, and so whether we're inside or outside, a lot of our inside things are back almost 100% of where we were before. Maybe not quite the participation that we were, but pretty close.
I think across the board, I think especially in different parts of the country, I think Jeremy saw a lot in Florida. I know California, a lot of our churches, partly the weather works well when you're in Southern California, maybe to do that. But Texas, maybe where you're at, AJ, I know that churches took advantage of spaces they had, and whether that was on their own property or whether that was renting parks, whatever it might be, just to be able to allow more space for those connections to happen, were done really effectively by some congregations. And so that they were able to say, we still want to gather, but we want to do it safely. And sometimes often it gives a great reflection into the community that we value being together as the body of Christ.
As somebody whose job it is to sort of resource youth leaders, that's one of the things that I do. And the thing about the pandemic was that there was no universal yes or no, right? Like there was just no way for us at a big picture level to say like, absolutely, you should be doing blank, or you should absolutely not be doing blank. When it came to youth ministry and youth ministry programming, and was certainly like, we can say things about relationships, but when it comes to like indoors, outdoors, what does that look like? It is so specific to what's going on in your area. And so I think, part of me wants to just go to every youth leader and be like, do the best you can with what you have, and God will do the rest. We trust that God will work through whatever it is that you're able to do. We know that God continues to work through his word and sacrament, but and through his people, and we trust that, and we go, okay, maybe it's outdoors, maybe it's it depends on your space, depends on what you have access to, depends on a lot of different factors, but trying to compare to what's going on with your neighbor, especially right now in youth ministry, is really just not, it's not helpful usually, but it's definitely not always the most helpful thing right now.
Yeah, thanks for that, guys. We got some really good questions rolling in, so I'm gonna keep hitting some more. So a question from Mark here. He said, given the trend, as AJ pointed out, towards more individualized ministry, is that core group that connects through relationships and youth group and ministry likely going to be smaller than Gen Y, and even more so now, post-pandemic, given our isolation from each other for the last 18 months? So, anybody got thoughts on that? Do you think we will continue to trend this way? Will we get to even smaller groups, more individualistic ways of doing ministry? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I think the small group model, is really starting to be more prominent, especially in mid-pandemic kind of season that we're in right now. And I think having those small groups, is going to build some of the intentional relationships and just deeper conversation as a whole for people. And I think our students will respond really well to that.
So you might, I think from a number standpoint, you might see that. We'll see how long that takes maybe for that thing to transition. But like I think AJ said, that doesn't mean that don't feel bad about your service or what's going on in your congregation. That the Holy Spirit works through those relationships. And we continue to pray for those young people or families who may be disengaged, that they're going through some really difficult times. And so let's that be as an opportunity to hopefully as the body of Christ reach out to them, and really for the church to be that a group of believers who's investing in them for positive things to continue in their life along the line as they trust in Christ. So I think, that there might be some conversations churches have to have around if you're looking at numbers and trends to see that and expect that. But yet that doesn't mean, again, the Holy Spirit's not at work through Christ's word. And that I think you said it too, Cassie, about doubling down on those individual relationships might be a time, or at least a season, for us to be thinking about that in our youth ministry.
Yeah, I think small groups and core connections where you can really build and dig deep with each other are going to be huge. I think we can look backwards and see how that's played a huge role in maybe how we've even been formed and grown. But I see a trend too with my middle schoolers, which is interesting. I'm having more middle schoolers showing up than I did pre-pandemic because they haven't had a whole lot of other places yet that were open to having larger groups come and play and have some fun and a trusted space. And so the younger Gen Zers they were excited to be in person, and their parents were excited to be in person. And so that my middle school group is actually bigger than it has been. My high school group's still about the same because they've found those communities with or without the church's help that they, like AJ mentioned earlier, where they've created their safe spaces. And so how do we tap into those safe spaces? You get a safe space that is willing to connect and open up, and you've got a small group that's already been formed. You didn't have to do the work. How do you plug into that and connect with that?
Yeah, I would say, if we look at, like, do we think that X, Y, or Z is going to happen post-pandemic? I don't think anybody's going to be able to tell you exactly what the church is going to look like after this. We're still figuring that out. I mean, we know that going into the pandemic that Gen Z was the least connected to church, was the least Christian generation. And so, like, so that's not suddenly going to change because of the last 18 months. I do think the church has a really great opportunity to step into that relational space. And you heard that the young people last week really asking for that. I saw a statistic that today, and I didn't get a chance to run it up too much, so I take it with a grain of salt, but the young people said about 10% of them said that a faith leader had reached out to them in the last 18 months in that pandemic. 10%. So even if right now you're feeling a little bit hopeless and lost in what is the church going to look like, hey, there's still plenty of time and space for us to connect, and for, like Jeremy said, for us to be the place that they do find if they have been isolated and haven't felt like that. There is still time for the Holy Spirit to work to bring us back into this relationship that can move the church forward.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, I think, with the growing amount of safe spaces that students have been finding themselves in, it's not that we want to break away those students away from those safe spaces and say, hey, your church is actually going to be your safe space, but how can we actually allow the gospel to permeate within these safe spaces as these students are starting to take on different leadership roles, starting to be entrepreneurials? How can they use their influence in order to bring the gospel in their own safe spaces that they're already in?
Yeah, great insight, everybody. We have excellent questions rolling in, so I'm just gonna hit the next one. This is from Ryan. And this is something I've talked a lot about with youth leaders and with pastors all over the country. But he asked, what is your perspective as to what youth ministry is going to look like in the coming years? Is there a need for small groups, meeting off campus, more one-on-one meetings? What do you guys think? And we'll clarify, right? We are not mind readers or fortune tellers. We don't know exactly what is going to be the need and what is going to be to come. So we are speculating based on what we know. And I know this is a wise group of experts who do a lot of research, but what do you guys think youth ministry especially is going to look like in the upcoming years?
Yes. I mean, seriously, I mean, yeah, I don't know, but what I do know is what I've seen work in past generations and then now in this generation is that there is a need for community. We've been created that way. So how you can create a positive and safe community or tap into one that's already created, as AJ's mentioned, that already exists, and be in those communities with them, knowing that and trying to build that trust, being authentic. Those are all huge things, whether that's a group of 3 or 4, or whether that's a group of 34. I don't know. It's going to be different for different people. But how you create that community or tap into that community, because that's going to be a need, whether it's virtual, in person. And we're relational people. We need that. So that's got to be something that we look at, and your situation is going to dictate how that looks.
I think part of the thing I laugh when I see, like, what do I think youth ministry is going to look like? It is really fascinating to me that in many ways, when I was trained, we talked very much about programs and how do you do the program part of this, and you would look at other people's programs and how do you tailor it to yours. I feel like as we look at youth ministry now, it is going to become much more not just relational but intergenerational. It's about incorporating them into the body of Christ, which I feel like we do really well to start out with as Lutherans, and it's going to look more innovative. It's going to be different for every single setting, and it's going to be about kind of being invitational and being here and being a part of us, and whatever does that look like. Now that gets really hard for youth leaders, because that's a lot harder to manage and plan and write a monthly calendar for, and what do I put in the monthly newsletter, like that. I think is a little bit nebulous for us to put our arms around right now. Like, what is that going to look like? But more and more we hear this generation looking like they don't necessarily desire one more thing to do on another evening, for another outing, for another activity. They can get that from a lot of places, and they don't need entertainment. They can get that from their palm of their hand on their phone. But what they need is a community that's going to point them to Christ, that's going to mentor them, that's going to love them, that's going to see them and know them. And that means youth ministry is going to look different. But like, what does that mean? I'm not sure we have a solid answer to that.
And I think that's something I see a big change, at least in my ministry. Maybe at one point I was doing a lot of really fun stuff all the time, but what I see our students asking for and our young people clamoring for, it's depth, and it's deep conversations, and it's not so much the fun thing with the slime and the whatever funny thing we come up with, right? But there has been a move towards counseling and walking with students in the good and bad times, and I think that will be a trend that we continue to see, that will be a greater value to our young people than anything fun and silly that we do plan. And I'm not to say that fun and silly doesn't matter, because there's a place for that too. But I know, like in our ministry, we have stripped back some of the weekly things that we had, and we're concentrating on like bigger things that bring in a group of kids to have fun, but then at the same time having the space to grab a couple of students and take them to Starbucks and talk about life seriously. So I think that there's going to be a balance that we are all working within our own context to figure out, and understanding that Jesus Christ lasts no matter what, right? So we have that assurance of the hope there that is well-founded. So
Cassie,
good.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go for it, Jeremy.
I was to say, you just reminded me of one of the things that I learned years ago in youth ministry, when planning an event that I thought I was going to have a number of kids show up, and you get one or two, right? And I think that's happening more now, because it's just it's harder to determine that. All right, is this an event that parents are going to say they can go to? Is this an event that kids are going to want to go to? And so one of the things that I learned right away was, don't cancel the event that you were planning for 20 just because 2 showed up. Use that opportunity to really establish the connection. Some of those times that I threw my plans out the window, and God had a better plan than I had to begin with. Go figure. And those relationships that were built with a couple of those kids were amazing, and better than I could have ever dreamed of. And so when we're trying to plan something, especially as we get into this coming back together, and it's not what you planned, don't get too frustrated with that. God's got a better plan than you had in the first place. Use those opportunities with 1 or 2 that do come to really start to establish a connection with them. They'll bring their friends along if they feel comfortable with you, if they feel that it's a trusted place to be, and that's amazing. When they know how much you care, right? That's the phrase. They'll care about what you care about.
Yeah, and as we kind of mentioned, it's hard to quantify sometimes your success in ministry overall, and I think that's a takeaway for our generation as adults. This is going to be a season where we have to be faithful, and we have to be patient, we have to be understanding, and perhaps this is our moment to step back and say, it's okay. God's got this under control, and it's going to be fine, even though I cannot maybe judge everything that I'm doing if it's effective or not. Maybe this is our season of just trusting and handing it over to God ourselves. I have a question here that was messaged to me. Amy wants to know, what are some effective ways to re-engage Gen Z as we enter this next phase? Are you guys seeing anything that is working?
Probably not. I'm just kidding. No, I think one of the things, and I guess this is going to go back to part of the question that you asked before. I think being able to reevaluate what the church is doing as a whole, for not only for our students, but for everybody. I think there's been such a culture of being consumers whenever you come into a Sunday morning experience. And I think we've looked at youth ministry in that aspect as well. Part of me is just wondering, what does it look like for us to move from youth leaders to more youth facilitators, where we can facilitate students to be able to gather together, but then allow them to be able to, because they're already content creators, they're already entrepreneurs, they're already business partners. And so being able to partner alongside them to be able to say, it's not going to be perfect, but we want you to continue to learn, and I want to walk with you and mentor you in that way to be able to lead, which I think sometimes can be so difficult especially for me, to say, no, I want to be able to do this, or I want this program to go this way, or an event to go this way. But how can we help empower students to be able to share the gospel that may not look like the way that I do it, but in a way that is translatable to other students, so that it's authentic, it's real, and encourages other students to be able to be engaged in that way. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, and I think it makes me think too that we have the opportunity to support each other, as different pastors and youth leaders and educators all across the table, coast to coast. It looks different everywhere right now. Everybody has to understand their own context, and it is not a time for us to be judging anybody else, right? Because we're all in this together. We're all one team. So, we all care about this next generation. We want them to be tethered to their Savior. So that is the overall unifying goal that we have. So if it looks different in different places, that's probably okay, right? We can accept that.
And then how cool does that look too when we realize and understand that it's not about us, that we can take those fences down, and how cool it'd be with the technology. And I don't know why we're not doing this more, that my youth kids could connect with AJ, because they might have something cooler to connect with him on something than they will with me. And, our youth are doing this already without us. So when we figure out that it's not about us and our programs and our numbers, we'll be so much better off. It's just helping the leadership of the congregation that hasn't operated that way to understand that too.
Yeah, very true.
I know with some other youth groups, I know churches have reached out to other people and sharing, especially in some of the hot topics that have happened, and a lot of the big conversations that our country's been having. And I think that's been really helpful to see that kind of co-collaboration between different churches and different leaders as well.
Great. Well, you want to close this out here? We're getting close to our timeline. Obviously, we've had a lot more questions. We just do not have time. So thank you to those who are throwing in their questions. But these are conversations we hope that you can have in your communities and with your own congregation and your families. So yes, do we have any final thoughts from this expert panel full of wisdom? Anyone? All right. Keep having these conversations because it is good stuff. And we know that this generation it is a powerhouse generation. They have a lot to offer. They are huge parts of our churches and our communities already, but they do need our support. They need some support from us who care about them. So if you want to continue these conversations, if you go to cph.org/Gen Z, there is a handy guide. It's got some discussion questions and some prayer points. So if you want to take that as a little devotional piece to maybe your family or your friend group, or maybe a small group Bible study, that is a good resource for you. Next week, we have a whole new panel talking about the digital generation and really like what will church look like and what can we do to reach out and impact and make sure that we are actually doing the good work of sharing the gospel with this next generation. So that will be another great panel, same time, same place next week at noon Central. But in the meantime, we are glad that you guys were here with us today. So thank you so much. Thank you to Concordia Publishing House for hosting this great webinar series. We will see you guys next week right here. Thanks.